Hello, welcome to this conversation that I'm having with Robert Beckford. Robert, good to have you in this talk. One of our new lecturers, researchers at the Faculty of Religion and Theology. And this this talk is also for our alumni who are connected to our faculty. So great to have you here. Maybe you can tell a little bit about your focus, your background, and especially what I'm very interested in. You've been doing a lot of work not only in theology, but also in media. How does a theologian end up on television?
Yeah, thank you for that question. To answer it, I've described three things about myself that culminate in being an activist scholar. First of all, I was raised as a Black Pentecostal in Britain. And one of the distinctives of the Pentecostal tradition is a focus on the dynamics of the Holy Spirit. But what I could never understand as a young person growing up in the Pentecostal church was how that personal empowerment never engaged with the socio-political world. It was always reduced to the body, a kind of Christian biopolitics. So one of the things that I set out to do in my academic work was translate pneumatology, the doctrine of the Spirit, into a political force, into a political theory. And that led me to the discovery of Black theology, which is the second thing that I would use as by way of introduction. I'm a Black theologian. I don't necessarily always call myself a Black liberation theologian because that's very African American, and I'm working with an African Caribbean tradition. But I was introduced to Black liberation theology as an undergraduate student, and that gave me the theological tools for developing a social justice approach to theology and a political pneumatology. However, as you'll know, all liberation theologians believe in praxis, and this is the third thing. You can't just talk theology, you have to do theology. So one of the ways in which I was fortunate enough to develop my craft as a theologian was through media, working in film, television, radio drama, and now studio music production. And I use those texts not just as media to articulate a message, but also as outputs to engage in political issues. So they do the work of social justice. They're not just another text, they are activist texts. They challenge injustice in the social world and lead to social change. So those three things really sum up the work that I do: the Pentecostal problem, introduction to Black theology, and then developing my craft as an activist scholar using media as a way of engaging with the social world.
I think many of our students, of our former students, they really relate to the link that you would make between theology and church, for example, or faith communities at large. Not all of them would see this direct link to popular culture and to politics. But you say that's a deeply theological act to be involved in that.
Oh yes, definitely. I think if we think in terms of religion in the broadest sense, Paul Tillich encourages us to understand it as that which grounds your being, then it provides us with a great scope for thinking about what are the sources of our theology. And within the theology and popular culture movement in Britain, which I was a part of for a while, we see popular culture as a text in which theological ideas are either projected onto or sometimes embedded in, so that they are used by church groups, by religious communities of popular culture to translate their message. Look, if you're going to a church like Hillsong in Amsterdam, then you can't help but be surrounded by popular cultural resources transmitting the gospel, whether it's in the music, whether it's the style of preaching, the theatrical environment. So whether we like it or not, culture informs our understanding of theology, and we are constantly in dialogue with the cultural ideas that shape us. Really important for Western theology, because Western theology has traditionally clothed itself in a myth of neutrality, believing that by appealing to objectivity, it doesn't necessarily then have to deal with its own subjectivity, the way in which culture, politics, history has informed Western theology. So these things are very important theologically.
Yeah. Well, I think today, Robert, one of the key topics of what we are discussing is how to live, how to survive in times of crisis. Corona being one of the major ones of them. But I think I would like to focus a little bit on the other crisis that's also really keeping us busy this year. The crisis about injustice, the crisis of that has been named Black Lives Matter following the debates in, for example, South Africa, United States, and so on. But increasingly the question of what it means to deal with racial differences and injustices. And you described yourself earlier as a Black theologian. What does Black theology have to say to this crisis that we're dealing with?
That's a really good question. I think there are three things that Black theology offers really, directly to this crisis. The first is a theological framework for evaluating issues around race and racism. The tragedy is that theology just hasn't done this kind of work. I don't know what it's like in your context in Holland, but in Britain, over the last 70 years, theologians have only produced one book. Theologians who are racialized as white, that is, one book addressing the question of the church and racism. In contrast, over the same period, they've written over 50 books on being nice to animals, animal theology. So, theologians haven't necessarily done this work in Europe. Black theologians have been doing this work for 70 years intensely. And, if you go back to Du Bois, the early 1900s, or even Marcus Garvey in the second decade of the 20th century, Black people have been working with theological ideas and issues of racial reconciliation. So it provides resources, and that's what makes it important. Secondly, I think it provides a praxis. It provides a way in which we can go about recovering a sense of community and collaboration, but it emphasizes the need to hear the voice of the oppressed. And that's one thing that we haven't really done well within Western theology, hearing voices from the margin, to quote Sugir Tharaja. I think the third thing is it provides us with a fantastic vision of what we can accomplish when we do use the tools, hear the people. It gives the vision that Black theology is incredibly prophetic, not just speaking truth to power, which is one part of the prophetic, but also envisioning a better world. And there's a lot of that kind of imagination, Christian imagination within Black theology. So I think it provides tools for racial reconciliation with those three.
What strikes me, Robert, is that link also to the points that you're making, that there's a huge gap between on the one hand, the Black community and Black theologians who are dealing with these issues, and on the other hand, let's say the majority white church and theologians who are not dealing with that. And this seems to parallel what's happening in society. And what I'm a little bit afraid of is that we are actually turning this into a polarization and a mutual anger that may not be fruitful in the long run. And how can we overcome that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we have to speak in many tongues, to use a Pentecostal phrase. What I've always found really important is not leaving my teaching exclusively to the university. I've taught in prisons. Sometimes they've mistaken me for a convict and almost locked me in, but that's a whole nother story. But I've taught in prisons, community groups, schools, synagogues, mosques, wherever I've had the opportunity to exchange ideas. I've taken advantage of that invitation, because I think that your work has to go beyond the academy. You have to be rooted in communities, not just your own religious or faith community, but community in the broader sense. I think that's really important, that we take our work outside and develop
building dialogues.
But also that we learn from the organic intellectuals, to draw from Gramsci. The idea that there are people embedded in communities who are articulating their issues and concerns. And I think that that's something that theologians need to embrace, to become organic intellectuals. And that's one of the models that's really, really inspiring. So if we don't do this, we become redundant. We become part of the problem and not part of the solution. There's a danger when we professionalize theology to the extent that it becomes distant from the church. That's a crisis for me. I've always thought that we need to bridge it. And obviously film has been another way in which I've attempted to bridge that gap.
Right. Well, you already mentioned the prophetic role and the teacher role. Maybe in building dialogues, there's also something like this priestly role that we know from classical theology.
Definitely. I think there is a pastoral responsibility, and that again moves us beyond the academy to think about a wider national global pedagogy. How do we engage and teach and intervene in many of the issues that we see present outside of the academy? So yes, I think that's part of the academic role. And I think that's what makes theology unique, particularly those who have a faith tradition as they form their theology, but not exclusive, because it also works that way with people of no faith. I'm good friends with Anthony Pinn, and I would say he's deeply pastoral, although being a humanist, deeply pastoral in terms of caring and practicing his beliefs in a constructive way in the North American context.
Thank you so much, Robert, for your insights. One of the pressing issues of the world at large that theology by its very nature should be involved in and is connected to. But our students and also our alumni are working in that world and are trying to make that connection. So thank you for your inspiration, and we hope to see a lot more of you at our faculty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this interview, and all the best to the alumni out there.